North Idaho College, and I'll be moderating the panel today, which focuses on work. Today's forum includes a number of very interesting people, and among them are Rosie the Riveter, Saint Benedict, Thorsten Veblen, John L. Lewis, and Mother Jones. And we would like to begin today listening to Rosie the Riveter.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Rosie, like you've heard. I'd like to share some of my memoirs with you today, if you would be so kind. I remember Pearl Harbor like it was yesterday. At the time, I didn't realize that what happened next would change my life forever. That was 3 years ago. It all started when Charlie got drafted for the war. Our boys were 10 and 7 then. It was hard for them to see their father take off to some place in the South Pacific that we had never heard of before. He left a week before Christmas. This was the first time our family had not been together for the holidays. It was hard. We all had to adjust a great deal. Before Charlie left, life was simple. Every day was like a familiar routine. Charlie would go to work while I stayed home and took care of the boys. After he left, well, everything changed. And it got turned all upside down. It was many months that he was gone. I started to get real lonely. The boys missed him too. I was so grateful that I had my family. They would invite us over on Sunday afternoons for dinner. My boys, Daniel and Jesse. They liked their grandparents' house. I think it reminded them of the times before Charlie left, when we'd get all dressed up in our Sunday clothes and attend church service, and then hurry on home to the parents' house for brunch. That seems so long ago now. I remember one evening in specific. I was helping Mama with the dishes. All of a sudden, I turned to her and I said, I can't take this anymore. Charlie needs to come home. That stupid war needs to end. He belongs with his family. Mama looked at me. She looked me right in the eye and touched my face with a soft hand. And she said, now you listen here, Rosalie, and you listen well. Charlie's out there fighting for your freedom, your boys' freedom, the freedom of our country. If all the soldiers just gave up now, we would lose the war and there would be no freedom. He's working hard and you need to support him in any way possible. Having pride for your country is the only thing that will win this war and bring Charlie home. Well, Mama was right. Always has been. She told me that I needed to stand by Charlie, and those words repeated in my brain over and over. And from that day on, I decided I was going to do exactly that. I was going to support my country and all the other boys and men, fathers and brothers that were across seas fighting for our country to be free. So naturally, when Charlie wrote me a letter telling me he was going to be transferred to Seattle, I started packing my bags, getting ready to go meet him there. Then I stopped, and I realized I had no clue where Seattle was at. So I got out my map, and I found it right next to the Pacific Ocean. If somebody would have told me on one of those Sunday afternoons that someday I'd be raising my boys by myself and living next to the ocean, I would have laughed in their face. But then there I was, getting ready to move hundreds of miles away from my hometown in Alabama. I was going to support him in any way possible. At first, Charlie didn't like the idea of the boys and I moving to Seattle to be with him. He told me that we belonged in Alabama with the folks. I tried to explain to him how much I missed him and how important it was to me that I be close to him. He just didn't understand. Those men never do. So I had to tell him flat out, Charlie, I don't argue with you much, but I'm putting my foot down. I'm coming to Seattle. Less than a month later, I was staring at the Pacific Ocean with Charlie by my side. Well, that didn't last long. He got sent overseas. This is when things really changed. Washington was so different than Alabama, and I had to give up the lush, relaxed life that I was used to. Soon I found myself sharing an apartment with another family and rationing food portions just to get by. Things were tough, but we are doing okay. I wrote Charlie every day. I still have some of the letters that I wrote him. This one is dated August 1942. Dear Charlie, it says, don't worry about us, darling. We're doing just fine. Some days I do think about going home and moving in with Mom and Pop, but I can't bear the thought of not being here on the shore when you return. Hurry home. We love you and miss you. Rosie and the boys. Life was tough, and money was hard to come by. I thought about going to work right away. I knew Charlie wouldn't like the idea of me getting a job, but I also had confidence that after I talked to him, he would want what made the boys and me happy. He was always that way. That's why I loved him. I decided to wait a week or two before looking for work. Well, early one Monday morning, I was listening to the radio that belonged to the family that resided with us when the Secretary of War, Henry L. Stimson, came on the radio to make public his plan to double the number of women hired in war jobs. As a matter of fact, I began to see this message everywhere. In the posters, in the shop windows, the newsreels at the movies, everywhere I looked, there was something encouraging women just like me to take part in the war effort. Times were rapidly changing, and I had to keep up. I decided to get a job. 2 weeks later, I landed myself a position at the Boeing airplane plant. My main duty there was working as a riveter producing airplane parts. I had this dandy little, almost like gun they called a riveting machine, and I would nail these rivets into these sheets of metal. And it would form these pieces that would be used for the airplanes. But it was more like art to me. I liked my work. I felt confident when I was working. I feel independent when I'm working. I told myself that every rivet I hammered home was a nail in Hitler's coffin. I wanted to do my part. And the traditional roles of knitting and buying war bonds just wasn't enough for me. I wanted to work. And that's exactly what I did. I work hard. I wrote Charlie about my job too. This one is dated September 1943. Hope you're not planning on challenging me to any games of arm wrestling when you get home, sweetheart. Because the truth is, I've developed a big bicep in my right arm. I've got more than a muscle to show for the work I've been doing. As a matter of fact, the girls and I earned an E award for efficiency last month. We doubled our production. How do you like them apples? Don't think those men at the factory gave us enough credit at first, but now they see that we can do it. Everything changed when Charlie left. Nothing would stay the same. I was independent. And I knew that he wouldn't necessarily liked it when he came marching home. But I wasn't going to give up my independence. I had tasted what it felt like to be a woman on my own. And that was nothing I was going to give up. I enjoyed having dirty hands while Charlie's been gone. And I'm not going to wash them off in dishwater after he returns. Well, I'd like to thank you all very much for letting me share my memoirs with you today. You've been so very kind.
Rosie, we thank you. St. Benedict, we'd like to hear from you.
Good afternoon. I come here this afternoon to ask you to assess the lifestyle that you're currently leading. And I would like you to consider an alternative. I believe many of you are currently leading a life that is filled with stress. You work very hard in jobs, trying to rise to the top in a very competitive environment. You work very hard to assemble many physical possessions. And in the process of trying to satisfy these desires that you feel, you develop a very large stress inside yourself. You have a very difficult time finding peace. My name is St. Benedict. I was born in 480 A.D. in Italy. It was a time period that modern historians would call the Dark Ages. In the first year of my life, the barbarians overran Italy. Odoacer assumed the throne of the Caesars. It was a time of misery throughout the land. Most people were hungry. Most people had no hope for advancing to anything other than a poor, destitute person struggling to get by daily. I was one of the fortunate ones. I had the opportunity to become learned. I studied in the schools of Rome. But I considered an alternative lifestyle to a life of luxury, and I adapted an austere lifestyle, one of the monastics of the society. An adaptation of an Eastern religion to a Western culture and a Western climate had been very difficult for those who attempted this monastic lifestyle. Penitential offerings of self-sacrifice in a fierce climate, in a culture where many were poor, made begging for a living very tough. Even the strongest became weak. The strongest became ill. Many lost faith, and many died. I lived this lifestyle for many years. As I lived with fellow men who had accepted this lifestyle, I was recognized as one who had understanding of what it took to be strong. Other men gathered behind me and encouraged me to lead them. So in 528, I assembled 12 organizations of men and dispersed them throughout the region of Italy. And at the same time, I wrote some guidelines for them to follow so that they could lead a monastic lifestyle. The monasteries that I organized were different from the previous Eastern monastic lifestyles. Work became a central part of our society. The monasteries were built in the middle of the fields. Walls were constructed around the fields. And inside those walls, the monks worked at tending the fields to produce the food that was necessary to sustain their life. In addition, most of the monks learned a skill so that they could produce a product and then sell it outside the monastery to help support our needs. Central to our lifestyle was our daily prayers. I wrote some rules to help guide the monks that I had dispersed. Through time, they became known as the rules of St. Benedict. These rules provided guidelines to the abbot, who was selected by the monks, so that this abbot could direct the monks in how they should lead their lives, how they should work, when they should pray. I would like to share with you one of the chapters that I wrote in my book. It's on daily manual work. It's chapter 48. Idleness is the enemy of the soul. Because this is so, brethren ought to be occupied at specified times in manual labor and at other fixed hours in reading. I probably should take this time to tell you that even though the Roman rulers had been overthrown, part of their culture stayed behind. Time was still broken into hours. There were 12 hours of daylight and 12 hours of dark each day. That made it 80 minutes of darkness to an hour in the night and 40 minutes to an hour in the day in the winter, and then it would be reversed in the summer. So hours were important to the Benedictine monks following these guides. I therefore think that both of these, the manual labor and the holy reading, should be arranged as follows. From Easter to the 1st of October, on coming out from the prime, let the brethren labor till about the 4th hour. The 4th hour, we think about that probably was still in the darkness. So they started pretty early in the day. Then, from the 4th till the close of the 6th hour, let them employ themselves in reading. So we see that they get a couple of hours of reading. That's very important. Then, from the close of the 6th hour, let them rest. On rising from the table after the 6th hour, let them rest in strict silence. If anyone shall wish to read, let him do so as not to disturb any others. Let none be said somewhat before the time, about the middle of the 8th hour, and after that all shall work at what they have to do until evening. If, however, the nature of the work or poverty require them to labor at gathering in the harvest, let them not grieve at that, for then they are truly monks when they live by the labor of their hands, as the fathers and the apostles have done. Let everything, however, be done in moderation, for the sake of the faint-hearted. It was very important that the abbot care about the monks under his charge. The abbot had to understand the limitations of the men that lived with him, so that he would not ask too much of them. He had to understand about how much bread they needed each day to be able to fulfill their tasks. Prayer was very important. Each one of the monks would decide to live this lifestyle for their entire life. They would be committed to this lifestyle. Work was central. Work is the gift that the Benedictine monks could bring to the world around them. It was their chance at social fruitfulness. Work was the way that we as monks could be removed from our self-centeredness. It is our reason to exist that's larger than ourselves. Our work allows us to find our place in salvation. Creation occurred. Creation continues to occur. Work is the part that a monk can play in continuing the creation. It is our opportunity to interact with the people around us and help them see the beauty of the world as this creation advances. Work leads to our self-fulfillment. It allows us to understand the gifts that we have, but it also brings out in us the talents that we do not understand we have. We learn about the challenges of life through the struggles of work, through the mundane, monotonous routine that we must go through to work in the fields. But it gives us a sense of how important the fields are in our life, in the creation around us. That's why I hope, as you listen to me today, that you might think some about your life and the one that you have chosen. Maybe it is not so important to work for material goods. Maybe it is more important to do some work that will benefit the creation, do some work that will benefit the rest of society. As you do that, you will find an inner peace that you will probably find in no other way. Thank you.
Thank you, St. Benedict. The next person that we will hear from today is Thorsten Veblen, who lived between 1857 and 1929. He is a professor of economics and sociology, and he criticized American society from an evolutionary to cosmopolitan viewpoint.
Well, thank you. It's very appropriate that I would follow a monk who talks about work, especially since I'm not religious, but I am going to talk to you about work. I'm going to talk to you about something that's sort of dear and near to me, something called conspicuous consumption. I look out here and I see people and I see what they're dressed in. I see the clothing. I look outside and I see the cars that people come here in. I look out, I see the houses that people live in. And I find conspicuous consumption, a term that I coined, is very, very appropriate, because this is indeed a society of conspicuous consumption. St. Benedict talked about accumulation of goods and stress. Well, I'm going to talk a little bit about accumulation of goods too, and stress a little bit. But first, let me tell you a little bit about myself. I was born in 1857 in Wisconsin to a Norwegian immigrant family. I went to school, several different schools, Carleton College, St. John's Academy, Johns Hopkins. I taught at Stanford. I taught at University of Chicago. I taught at University of Missouri, New School for Social Research. By training, I'm a philosopher. I also have interest in economics, sociology. I died in 1929, so I saw a lot of changes between 1857 and 1929. I saw the expansion westward. I saw what Euro-Americans did to Indian peoples. I saw, in the name of greed, resource accumulation, etc., the expansion west, the exploitation of resources, the taking advantage of people. I saw the coming of the automobile. I saw the transition from horses to the horseless carriage. By the time I passed away, a man by the name of Charles Olds, making Oldsmobiles, most of you probably remember those. I think they might even still be made today. Charles Olds started something called the used car market about the same year I died in 1929. The used car market was intended to get people to buy newer and better cars, newer and better things. Today you call this consumerism, materialism, the accumulation of goods. Look in your closets. How many shoes do you have? How many shirts? How many pairs of pants? How many dresses? More, bigger, better. This is all part of what I called conspicuous consumption. Conspicuous consumption is the consuming of goods to be able to flagrantly flaunt how much you possess, how wealthy you are, or how wealthy you aspire to be. Poor people will buy things. They will buy things in order to look wealthier, to try to aspire to be like the upper class, to try to, at least on appearances, have things such as the upper class. Go to somebody's house for dinner. You'll go in. You might find a nice piece of furniture, the dining table, polished, highly polished wood, maybe oak. maybe mahogany, something more exotic. You'll find a nice little silver candlestick holder. You will find fine china. All of this is put out as a pretense, an aspiration to wealth. Accumulate goods. Accumulate more. Show them off. Flagrantly show them off. Flaunt them. Because you want people to know you're doing okay. This is what society tells you. More is better. Bigger is better. This is what I talked about in a book that I wrote in 1899. It was called The Theory of the Leisure Class, where people with wealth have time to be leisure, to have time to waste. They also had goods to waste. And then other classes started emulating the leisure class, so to speak, wishing for leisure themselves, wishing for those goods, aspiring to be like them. I wrote about this. I was kind of satirical about it. I kind of have a cynical attitude about things and whatnot. It became popular with people who were more or less radical, people who might have been considered socialist, but it wasn't popular with maybe perhaps the standard academic of the time. I did find a number of followers. Einstein even liked some of my work. Others as well. William Graham Sumner was a famous sociologist. I impacted him. He impacted me as well. But needless to say, what I wrote about holds true today. Conspicuous consumption. People will buy goods to show what they don't have in order to at least aspire to a degree of wealth, or, as you would phrase it today, to keep up with the Joneses, to be as good as the Joneses. So, since I've been alive again, and remember I died in 1929, so that was about 72 years ago that I died, I've noticed a lot of changes. One of the things that I see are these ads. Television, something new. It wasn't around when I was around. But television's got all these ads asking you to buy more, buy bigger, buy better. Buy something that is going to make you look better, whatever. Buy, buy, buy. You have a consumerist society. You have something called a Ford excursion. Cars in my day were built just basically to be used, to be run into the ground. You didn't go out and buy a new one every year. You didn't go out and buy one because you wanted to look better and sharper every year. You bought it because it was something to work, something that you could value, something that was useful. It had utilitarian value. Well, today you've got these cars that are humongous, monsters. The Ford Excursion, Chevy Suburbans. What purpose does that show? Except, again, to show you've kept up with the Joneses. I argued at the turn of the century about whether or not people would be able to have a salary, an income, a wage that would keep them going. Most people tended to live month by month. It seems that nothing has changed. Most people today live month to month. They do not build up a savings account. They do not build up what I would consider true wealth, which is security, the essence to survive, the basics of life. Products are made not just for their utilitarian value sometimes, but also to be what I consider to be conspicuous waste. Conspicuous waste. It has a utilitarian purpose perhaps, but it also wastes time, effort, and money. I saw something interesting a few weeks back. It was called the Academy Awards. The Academy Awards are a good example of conspicuous waste, conspicuous consumption. A dress which serves a utilitarian purpose may cost $5,000 or $10,000. That's conspicuous waste. But the fact that you can buy it indicates to people they can afford it. They're wealthy. So we've actually started valuing social repute rather than the ability to survive. Social standing becomes played off against the ability to survive. Becomes something very, very important. That's part of the leisure class. So what is human nature? What is it to be human? Are we inherently greedy? Do we want to be the best? Are we inherently competitive? I might argue there was some time in our evolution that part of our development was arrested, some of our moral development. We have sports where we pay people tremendous amounts of money to go out and act out violence, aggression, competition. That still exists today. It existed in my time as well. Again, that's conspicuous waste, conspicuous consumption. We are not concerned with the bare essentials of what it takes to survive. We're concerned about what other people think about us, how we appear to others. We are more focused on those type of things than we are on just survival itself. It doesn't matter if you're in the lower class, middle class, you still aspire to be in a class higher than you are. And you still buy those products to pretend, at least on appearance, that you are in that area or that higher class. One of the things that people tend not to have in the lower class is the time to waste that is found in the upper class. Needless to say, much of their time is spent in trying to acquire those things that strictly maintain an appearance of something that they're not. Again, conspicuous consumption. One last concept, extravagant inutility. That's a nice word, concept, phrase. Extravagant inutility. Conspicuous waste is related to this. All you have to do is take a look at a modern city by the name of Las Vegas, and all of a sudden you understand what extravagant inutility means. Something that's mostly show, mostly go, but serves very little purpose. On that note, I will let you go for the time being. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Veblen. And now we'd like to hear from John L. Lewis, who is the president of the United Mine Workers of America.
I was president of the United Mine Workers for 40 years, and I was something of a man. I was born in February of 1880, and I was forged and molded in the crucibles of the mining communities and cultures, and I learned the grinding poverty and the dangerous, dirty, disease-ridden work. I learned that early as a youth and as a young man as I traveled throughout the West and worked in the mines of western states. And I was convinced that I would work and fight for the rest of my life for the miners. And I did that. In 1907, I returned to Lucas, Iowa, and I married Myrta Bell, a wonderful young woman who would have such a great impact on my life. And the very same year, 1907, I'm 27 years old, I ran for mayor of Lucas. I lost only because my father-in-law campaigned against me. He had other hopes for me. In 1908, Myrta and I moved to Panama, Illinois, and I went back into the pits and became active in the local mining union. I worked hard and very soon was president of the local union. And through my hard work and ability, the United Mine Worker leaders and even Samuel Gompers recognized me and rewarded me by making me a mine organizer. It took me out of the pits and put me on the road. And I traveled from Arizona to Virginia to the anthracite communities of Pennsylvania, trying to organize the non-union mines. In 1925, after I became president of the United Mine Workers in 1920, and that was because of a lot of hard work, well, and some breaks, and some political maneuvering, and I would hold that job as president of the United Mine Workers for the next 40 years. I don't need to tell you about the conditions of the miners in the 20s. If you know anything about Mother Jones and her great work and what she said about the miners living in pigsties owned by the company, being indebted to the company stores owned by the company, indebted to the company, the miner and his family owned by the company, enslaved by the company. Abraham Lincoln said, "We cannot live half slave, half free." And I was determined to change that. In 1925, I wrote a book called The Miners' Fight for American Standards. And I tried to point out to the government and to the people that the United Mine Workers were responsible for improving the living standards and wages of all the miners in the Union mines. And that we were responsible for helping the new immigrant foreign workers in the mines become Americans and become American citizens. We were determined to end that exploitation. When the United Mine Workers says they will not take a step backward, they speak in unison with the heartbeat of Americans, and they put into the strongest language the very spirit of Americans. Wherever I went and negotiated and bargained with the non-union mine operators, I was told the miners had it better than any other working group of people. It became evident to me that if labor was going to make any social progress, any economic progress, we were going to have to organize all the working people in the country. But I met with resistance from the AFL because they were concerned only with craft unions. They were concerned only with their own specific personal spheres of importance in their own empires, in their own little empires. In 1935 at our national convention, I spoke to all the membership of the AFL, and I said, the labor movement is based on the principle of the strong helping the weak. American institutions are based on the principle of the strong helping the weak. What is wrong with helping the less fortunate? With giving them something of our strength? With giving them something of our knowledge and our wisdom and our virtues and our resources? And if their status changes and they become improved and have a better standard of life, we all benefit. We all improve. We all have a better standard of living. Strong men do not always remain strong. The same is true for unions. The craft unions today may stand on their own feet and stand before the gales and the lightning. But that may not always be so. They may not always stand before the gales and the lightning. I tell you to prepare yourself to help your less fortunate brethren to heed this voice from Macedonia that comes from the hearts of men. Organize the unorganized. And that's what we did. We organized the millions of American working men and women. Some of our activities and some of our strikes failed. Some were very successful. And I was convinced that the president and the leaders of government had deserted and abandoned labor. And in September of 1937, I spoke to the American people in my annual Labor Day address. I said, labor has always been a friend. of the American people. It has defended private property. It has defended the right to invest for profits. That labor, the working man with a good job, a partner in productive, in profitable production, and secure in his own home, and with a good standard of living, is the best bulwark against the invasion of foreign, alien types of government. But labor, like Israel, has many sorrows. And its women weep for their fallen. It laments for the children and the race. And the very sad thing is that it ill behooves one who has supped at labor's table, who has been housed in labor's, who's been sheltered in labor's house, to curse with equal fervor and fine impartiality both labor and its adversaries as they are locked in deadly embrace. In 1940, I resigned as president of the CIO when Roosevelt was reelected. I kept my word and my promises. I had many failures. I had some successes. But in failure, that is part of life. Tomorrow is also a day. And I care not about yesterday insofar as it may give us the wisdom to make decisions and to guide our steps tomorrow. A statesman said, the highest mountains are very cold. That is true. The poet said, who climbs the highest mountain will find the loftiest peaks encased in ice and snow. I'm sure that's true. It's true for labor. It is true for other fields of endeavor as well. But that is not very important. We should always remember that tomorrow is the day that all men and women must face. I care nothing about yesterday. The doors of history swing on very small hinges. I find nothing more barren than to consider what might have been. I care not what might have been. I care only about today, and I care only about the sunrise tomorrow and the new dawn, and for this I live and have lived. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Lewis. I have a question. Mother Jones, as a labor agitator and being with us today, how does it feel to be seated next to Mr. Lewis?
I think this works. Mr. Lewis and I have had our differences, that is true. Mr. Lewis always considered me the grand old dame of labor organizing. I remember I said at one time in the early days of labor organization that there were no fancy halls, there were no high salaried officers, and there was no feasting with the enemies of labor. Now, it is true I have accused Mr. Lewis in the past of being one of those high-salaried officers and one of those officers feasting with the enemies of labor. But I can honestly say that Mr. Lewis and I have done the best that we could do given the circumstances that we were given. So it feels good to sit here with Mr. Lewis today.
Thank you. And Mr. Lewis, listening to what you had to say today, I'm wondering, do you think there were critical moments, or maybe a critical moment, or a courageous act that perhaps may have happened during your leadership of the CIO?
If there was one single incident and event that I think changed and saved the labor movement and the unions, it occurred late in 1936 when we had been organizing all of the new industrial unions and workers. And late in December 1936, the United Auto Workers staged a sit-down strike. The union called for a sit-down strike. The workers didn't leave the factories. They just sat there. Their wives and families brought them in food and clothing and whatever they needed. And they proceeded to arm themselves with all the machinery inside. The situation was very dangerous, was very critical, was very tense. And through the month of January, we tried to negotiate. Neither General Motors, executives, and management would budge an inch. They weren't going to recognize the union. They weren't going to talk for the union. And toward the end of January, the courts issued an injunction for the auto workers to get out of the factories. And now it became very, very critical what was going to happen. Was there going to be violence? Were they going to be forced out? Everybody was extremely worried. And on the last day when the National Guards and all the police moved in and surrounded the factories, and there was no further progress in negotiations, and that was on February 9th, Tuesday, February 9th, 1937. And late that night, a knock on my hotel door, and I answered the door, and it was Governor Frank Murphy, governor of the state of Michigan, a great Democrat, mentioned as a presidential candidate in 1940, and a great friend of labor. Governor Murphy said, "Mr. Lewis, I have here the order to execute the injunction. As a publicly elected official, I must uphold the law. I must execute the injunction." He handed me the order, and he said, "Sir, what will you do?" And I said, "Governor Murphy, do you mean to tell me that you're going to force those men out at point of bayonet and bullets? That you, Governor Murphy, are going to enforce the law and destroy the lives of those men and their families, their hopes and dreams?" I must remind you, Governor Murphy, that when the British government came against the Irish Revolution, you did not say, "Oh, we must uphold the law and support the British." Governor Murphy, I must remind you that when the British government arrested your father and put him in jail, I did not hear you shout holy hosannas and say, "It is good to throw my father in prison because the law is great and we must uphold and enforce the law." And Governor Murphy, when the British seized your grandfather and hung him by the neck until he was dead to enforce the law, I did not hear you say, "Oh, the law is pure. The law is good. Blessed be the sanctity of the law." You want my answer, Governor Murphy? I give it to you, sir. Tomorrow morning, I shall enter Chevrolet plant number 4. I shall march to the nearest window and throw it open. I shall remove my coat and my shirt. And when you give the order for your troops to fire and the first bullets strike my chest and my dead body falls to the ground, you listen to your grandfather say and whisper in your ear, Frank, Frank, have you done the right thing? Governor Murphy seized the order, crumpled it up, and walked out of the room without saying a word. The next day, on Thursday, February 11th at 2:45 a.m., General Motors capitulated. They recognized the auto union. We negotiated a settlement, and we began to make automobiles again.
That was a critical moment. Are there some of you that have questions for our panel? Questions?
I have a question for Rosie. Just a minute. We need to get you on the mic. We'll record this, and that's probably have to do it.
I have a question for Rosie. Are you seriously maintaining that women could do with the difficult physical labor in airplane factories, that women could do that work just as well as men? And if you are maintaining that, why is it that most of your coworkers left the factories after the war and men went right back into those factory jobs?
Yes, I do believe with the proper training, it's possible for a woman to be physically able to do the jobs that were required by the men in the factories. Now, any regular woman wouldn't be able to walk in and just start doing this work automatically. But we built our muscles in the factory there, and you saw women easily carrying 120, 140-pound discs with the ease of a man. To address the second part of your question, the number of women being reduced after the war, that was very much a part of the people who ran the factories. A lot of the factories were reduced to zero because even though they saw that us, the women, could do the work, they still didn't want to admit it. They still wanted the men to be the main working class, and we had to come a long way till we could become equal in the workforce. It took a long time. So yes, I think we were physically able. Thank you.
So Rosie, do you have anything you'd like to say about feeling faced with discrimination or segregation?
Very much so. When I went to work there as a woman in the factories, I very much wanted to be equal with everybody around me. But it wasn't so. I wish I could say it was. There was discrimination against colored women. There was discrimination against women. The colored women had to work in a different part of the factory, and they were usually the last ones to be hired when there was nobody else to fill the position. And just being women, somehow the men believed that because our husbands were away at war, that they had the right to harass us, sexually this is. And it was very much a problem because it's hard to concentrate on your work when you don't feel equal with the people around you. So discrimination and segregation was a big problem. By the end of the war, these problems had gotten better, but they were not solved.
Question.
Mother Jones, in listening to you talk this morning, you had lost 4 children and a husband. Most of us as women would have had to take years to grieve that before we picked ourselves up and went on. You had a moral courage that Clay Jenkinson talked to us about in Certain People. How do you explain that? Where did that come from? How did you hone that?
I think it came from my background I was raised in a very poor family. We all worked hard. We were all raised Catholic. I think that that background gave me the strength and the courage to carry on. And also, labor gave me a reason. The needs of the working people in this company, in this country, gave me the strength that I needed, knowing that there was something that I might be able to do to make their conditions of employment better, and especially when I saw the plight of children in the cotton mills of this country, in the textile mills. I think it came from my religion, I think it came from my family, and I know it came from the people with whom I associated.
Okay. Other questions? Yes.
I'd like to ask Mr. Lewis if in his day the CEO salaries were not that much greater than the workers' salaries, or was there a tendency to be like it is today with CEOs with a severance package getting almost $2 million? Is there that kind of a problem back in your day?
Ma'am, in my negotiations and bargaining with the chief executives of the different industries and the non-union mines, everyone that I negotiated with had a salary far greater than mine. I remember negotiating with General Motors, and one of the chief executives, a man by the name of Mr. Smith, was seated next to me, and I said, "Sir, would you move a little closer to me?" And he looked at me, and I said, "Move closer yet." And we were about 6 or 8 inches apart. I said, "You're not close enough yet." He said, "We're almost sitting in each other's lap." I said, "Move closer, sir. I want to tell my grandchildren one day that I sat next to $6 million. Even in comparison to the salaries today, and then right after World War II, the miners' wages were frozen, but prices had gone up 124%. And the miners' wages hadn't gone up one single solitary penny. After 1943 and 1946, when I was held in contempt of court, and I would do the same thing again, they could hold me in contempt of court again. And we paid the fines, but we were able to secure a wage increase for the miners, and their salary for a day's work at that time, even increasing, was about $13 a day. So in comparison to the salaries of the owners and the executives, it lagged far behind.
Mr. Lewis, what was your relationship with Roosevelt, and what was the basis for your resignation and the promise you referenced keeping?
I supported Franklin Delano Roosevelt for president in 1932 and again in 1936. And I was a great advocate of the New Deal, and I think he represented the great hope for all of the working people in the country. And the United Mine Workers gave President Roosevelt $500,000, which was an awfully lot of money at that time, in those days in 1936, for his campaign, believing that he would continue to be a friend of organized labor. And I believe he did not help us at all. He was very, very reluctant to come out for and fight for the steel workers and the CIO, to fight for the United Auto Workers. It was very, very difficult to get Mr. Roosevelt and his administration, save for Secretary of Labor Francis Perkins. And that led me finally to make a break with Mr. Roosevelt. And at the time, too, I thought he was preparing to go to war in 1937 and 38 and 39. And I believed that we should not become embroiled in war in Europe at that time. My opinions later changed, certainly, but at that time I did not agree with war preparations. I saw it as a way of war as nothing more than killing young men who would make great leaders, great workers, that we would waste the cream of our young men, and I did not agree with that. I threw my support to the Republican Wendell Willkie in 1940, and I told the CIO that if Roosevelt won, I would have to resign, and so I did that.
This question is for Mr. Veblen. In the state of affairs of the population of the world, do you really think that without consumerism that we would actually be able to support all of the people of the entirety of the world?
That's an interesting question. My thinking in terms of what I witnessed and saw at the time I was living was on the fast, rapid rate in which we were using resources, and the fact that we started focusing more on social standing than living. In terms of my concerns at the time, I saw that resources were being used a little too fast, unwisely, and frivolously in terms of materials and products that were basically designed to enhance social standing and not necessarily for utilitarian purposes. I think that given the population of the world today as it exists, and keep in mind that it's about 4.5 billion more than in my time and whatnot, that I think it's even more crucial that we pay attention to how we use those products that are out there. If we are using them just for a social standing enhancement, we are actually going to be wasting a lot of things as opposed to conserving, using them wisely for the future. My concern basically was looking at waste as opposed to what is necessary and essential for living. And I think we are, in this world, a lot more serious jeopardy than ever before in that sense. Does that address it?
Benedict, what good did your order do for the common man?
Common man. What is a common man? I would hope that through our teachings and the way that the monastic society interacted with the rest of the people, they understood that there was an alternative to the lifestyle that some people believed was necessary, one of greed, one of oppression. I died long before the time of the rest of the performers on the stage, and it's become obvious to me from listening to them that the barbarians must still be ruling. My message must not have worked very well. The strife that must have occurred between these people and other members of their society must surely have been barbaric. The struggles that took place with these workers and their labors, it is unfortunate they didn't listen to me, because there is a difference between labor. The labor that I, as a monk, would do in the fields was tedious labor. But I had a vision beyond that there was good works that came from my labor. And it is unfortunate that some of the people that were at conflict with these men and women on the stage, it's unfortunate that the people in power didn't realize that there were good works that came from these folks' labors. So maybe the hope that I had for bringing some spirituality and some peace of mind to the common man, it doesn't sound like it did a very good job.
Mr. Lewis, I was wondering, how do you view the states who have adopted the right-to-work policy? And if you do not agree with that, what advice do you give the people to change that?
Well, I certainly would be the first person to disagree with the right-to-work policy. I fought with all my strength and energy against that terrible, disgraceful piece of legislation, the Taft-Hartley Act. It is the most infamous, the most fascistic act ever written in the United States of America. And I would fight today if I was around, and I would encourage all of labor and all of the working people to fight as hard as they can against the right to work and against the Taft-Hartley Act. As I said before, you know, a people who have good, livable wage jobs and a good standard of living, we all benefit. And there's nothing wrong with that.
Yes, I have a question for the professor. I've heard it said that if you're not a good consumer, you're not a good American. And if we were all to suddenly magically become more conservative consumption peoples, would not our nation fall economically?
An interesting question. I suppose that can get into some ideology in terms of defining what is an American. But in truth, I would possibly argue that a person who uses resources wisely, who does not waste a lot of materials, does not buy just for the sake of buying, is probably a better citizen. My models and my theories were sometimes at odds with Karl Marx, but in other times I kind of supported a lot of what he thought about and how he approached looking at the system the way it is set up now. I called big business interests predators, and the victims of those predators are essentially the average common working person. And I think that there needs to be some sort of changes to accommodate those people. And I think that the consumerism really is just another way of exploiting those particular people. And I do believe that one could probably reorient their thinking and still be a good citizen and not have to worry about being also an avid consumer. I think for the future, for future generations, that this may be actually wise thinking.
Kind of answered that, but when he talked about consumer, was it conspicuous or whatever?
Conspicuous consumption.
Consumption. Does that mean that like it was self-gratification, throwaway society, convenience type? Is that where?
That's part of it, but it's also the purchase of goods for the appearance of prosperity. You purchase goods in order to appear something that you may not be, to aspire to a lifestyle that may not be yours. But conspicuous consumption means obvious consumption. People who can afford to buy things are obviously doing better. And people aspire to materialism and accumulation of those material goods to appear wealthier than they really are.
This is for Rosie. Rosie, how long did it take us at the beginning of World War II to convert into a wartime economy? And then when the war was over, how long was it before we could actually go out and buy a car, as an example?
I got a little flustered there for a second.
How long did it take us to start producing tanks and guns and jeeps and all of that instead of the cars and refrigerators and electric ranges?
I'd have to be completely truthful with you. I don't really know the answer to that question.
Well, I know you weren't born. You worked hard, but you were not born yet.
Right.
Actually, that, oh boy, get away from there. Actually, that's a compliment because, see, she thinks that that's who she really is.
Okay. Was there another question?
Right
over
here's one.
Yeah.
I have a question for St. Benedict. Living as we do among the barbarians, do you think it is possible for any more than just a very few to live a monastic life?
Only a very few to live a monastic life. I don't see why that wouldn't be possible. The man sitting to my left has pointed out that a lot of the consumption in our society is needless, and as a monk living the monastic life according to my philosophy, we were able to have a very fulfilled life. We had enough to eat, we had time to read, we had time for introspection, we were able to bind with the earth, we were able to understand the seasons, we were able to work in God's creation. I don't understand why all of people couldn't live that way. We didn't have to beg from anybody. We didn't have to rely on anybody. We were able to be quite self-supportive. Many other people, I think, could benefit from the way we lived. The inner peace that can be attained through good works, I think that's possible for everybody.
This is for the professor. My question was, don't you think that some of our needless consumerism has actually helped us to increase our lifestyle so that we have went from a time where, such as the monk was, where people were starving and hungry all the time, to where now most people, even if they're poor, have food. And part of that is because of our needless consumerism, we build so much.
I wouldn't want to confuse needless consumerism with advances in technology and industry. I'm actually a very strong supporter of industry and technology that serves the people. And I actually envisioned a society that was not run by the people who were profiting from the needless consumerism, but from people who understood how to deal with the technology and deal with its practical application in a way that served everybody. So I'm not against that. What I am against is the selling of goods and convincing within people that they need to buy those goods to be somebody that they're not. And that shouldn't be confused with a good standard of living, perhaps. I would not disagree that this particular society and the way that the consumerism has enhanced competition between different industries has not improved the quality of life. Indeed, it has. But needless to say, a lot of what's out there and a lot of what people are being convinced to purchase and to buy is mostly lining other people's pockets at their own expense. And there are some things I think need to be looked at in terms of that.
Thank you. At this point, I'd like to thank the panel for their spiritual, mental, physical attentiveness to the working world, and ask the characters to break character and talk a little bit about themselves, introduce themselves, and talk a little bit about the interest in the character, along with just a little bit of bio about yourselves. Alan?
I guess I'll go ahead and start. I'm Alan Lamb, and I'm a sociology, anthropology teacher here at the college. And You probably would have guessed that since I picked a sociology economist person that I would talk about them. And I picked the person because of the idea of conspicuous consumption. It's being revisited. There's actually an international Thorsten Veblen Association or society. His work is being revisited by a number of scholars, and they're looking at what's happening in current society as being perhaps a manifestation of what he kind of predicted and what he kind of said. So I think he's a lot more important than people have historically given him. A lot of people in this room probably have never even heard of Thorsten Veblen. Those that have, either you're a sociologist or you're in literature, you're an English teacher or something like that. His reading is difficult. If you try to read his book on the theory of the leisure class, you'll find that there's a lot of satire in there, and it's hard to get some of the theory out of the satire. His other works would ramble on and go different directions, etc. His academic life was not necessarily the best. He was not a good teacher. He would come in and he would mumble to his students. He also had a lot of female students that decided that they would like to have relationships with him, so he was not exactly what you would call a moral, upstanding community member in terms of the academic community. He lost his job at University of Chicago because of extramarital affairs. He lost his job at Stanford because of extramarital affairs. He did not maintain very good reputation in academic institutions at all because he wasn't a good teacher as well. So he had his problems, but he did have some pretty good ideas. Interesting fellow.
Dale Marcy. I teach chemistry and environmental science at North Idaho College. I picked this character because Tony invited me to take part in the panel on the day about work, and so I had visited with Denise Clark, and we talked over, well, wonder what the basis of the concept of work is. So we did a little work, and we came up with St. Benedict. As it turns out, he probably wrote the first Western description of executive work plan. He used the Roman concept of time and divided up time for the monks. Prior to him, the Eastern religions had been focused on penitential exercises, sort of mental self-abuse, and starving, and that just wasn't very suitable. Most people couldn't survive that. He must have been really strong because he did, but he noticed that there was still the needs in society for people to get in touch with themselves, so that's why he wrote the code. And the code was a description of the workday. When you got up, when you ate, when you slept, and when you thought about life in general. So it was quite interesting to read the code and quite interesting to read the impact. Nels asked me what the impact was on society. As it turned out, it probably helped stem a lot of the barbaric acts through Europe, because the monks were a very calming effect on the society. They were very hardworking. And so it is a basic part of Western work tradition, the fact that we put in an honest day's work and expect an honest day's pay. And if the barbarians hadn't continued to rule, we wouldn't have the other people on the stage.
Thank you, Father. My name is Ken Pello, and I'm a retired high school teacher from Rogers High School in Spokane, where I taught history and government and economics for approximately 37 years. And for the last few years, I was chairman of the Democratic Party in Spokane. And I really want to thank Tony Stewart for his great work in this program, and above all for his ability to cast people so well, because I know that Tony doesn't know this, but I was raised and I grew up in a mining community, and members of my family were miners, went down into the mine, and I remember so very well as a very young child in 1943 when my father came home from work crying, saying that there'd just been an explosion in the mine and Uncle Bill was in the mine. And 75 miners lost their life that day, and that was in Montana. I remember going to school every day to see in the news office the sides and the ends of the dynamite boxes that had been brought up where the miners wrote farewells to their wives and loved ones and died a few hours after the explosion. And so it had a tremendous impact on me. Shortly thereafter, the miners left the families with very little compensation for that. It was an example still of the terrible attitudes of the mine owners toward the people. And so in all my readings and in all my work here with John L. Lewis, it only fortified all of my beliefs and all of my convictions and all of my values about the value of working people.
I have to get my own. My name is Denise Clark, and I played Mother Jones today during one of the popcorn presentations. Why did I choose Mother Jones? Mother Jones, one of her most famous comments was, "If you must pray, pray for the dead, but then you fight like hell for the living." And when I read that, about 4 years ago, that resonated with me. Those lines I never forgot. I love that old woman. She was mean, and yet she was loving. She would have loved Thorsten Veblen. This is what she carried with her right here. A change of clothes when she traveled, a carpet bag, her hat, and her purse, and that's all she owned in this world. Bringing Mother Jones back to life, because she has been hidden within the shadows of history, and I think for far too long. And I decided I wanted to bring her back to life for all of you today. I would like to continue to keep her alive. And it's just given me a great pleasure to be here. And I might say that all of these people sitting here, Mother Jones would have resonated with every one of them.
My name is Amanda Knapp, and I'm a student here at NIC majoring in theater. I decided to do the Popcorn Forum first upon invitation. Dorinda Moyer, as many of you may know, did Rosie the Riveter for the past couple years. And she actually moved away, and she asked me to do this personally, so I thought it was quite an honor. But also, I liked the dramatic aspect of the popcorn, but then taking it to more depth, having a character with meaning that goes past just the lines that you might see in a play. Also, Rosie the Riveter was a symbol that represented a very significant part of our country. World War II was a time of great change in so many different ways, but focusing just on how it brought about a culture, really. As a young woman, my work is very important to me. I love working. I love it, and I wanted to individualize Rosie the Riveter, give her a name, give her a face, let you guys see that it's just these simple, everyday people that make so much of a difference, and the work that was done by these women really started a change that hasn't stopped. We still see it today. It very much opened up turned from suppression into expression. When women went to work, it allowed us to feel confident and make our own decisions, and this was something that didn't happen very often before then. Women felt like they had to have their choices made for them, or many times they lived behind their husband, and I think World War II and women going to work changed this. And you see that in our world today. We see women in high positions, and I think that's very important. especially for a girl like me that really likes my work.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for coming, and this concludes our panel today. And take note of the events that are happening tomorrow. Pick up a flyer. I believe there are some in the back. But note that George Frine will be Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens, tomorrow morning at 11 o'clock in Boswell Hall, followed by the Human Rights Banquet tomorrow evening. Oh, yes, and I'm sorry. And the panel this evening will take place at 7 o'clock, and it'll go from 7 until 8:30, and it will be a response panel on humor. So I think you will find it entertaining and full of some interesting surprises. Thanks for coming.